Okay, let's get started. I wrote columns and op-eds for 25 years before being introduced to the particular approach that I'm going to share with you. But what I like about this approach is that it provides an easy way in to marshalling the knowledge you have, which is probably vast, into something focused, short, and publishable. It's essentially a 5-step approach, and we're going to go through each of those steps one at a time. As I mentioned, accessibility is key. If you're used to talking about a complex subject to colleagues who understand the language and the jargon and the details of what you're talking about, you'll probably often use jargon or words that are not accessible to the average reader of a daily newspaper or an online news site. So, key to writing an op-ed for public consumption is that you get rid of all of the language that's going to make what you're writing about inaccessible to other people. One of the pieces of advice that I've found really useful is to start by writing at the top of your page, "Hi, Mom." Unless, of course, your mother is also a nuclear physicist and knows as much as you do about whatever the subject is. So in that case, you can use your dad or your 15-year-old neighbor. What you're looking for is imagining an audience member who is intelligent and thoughtful, but not an expert in the area that you are. Okay, the first step in the 5-step process is identifying and articulating your basic argument, your thesis. So if you graduated from university, you had to write essays, you had to come up with a thesis statement for your essay. This is very similar. What you want your thesis statement, however, to do is to be really clear and simple and express in one short sentence what you want people to think or believe after they've read your commentary. So that's your goal. Here are some examples of theses that previous students of Informed Opinions have used to guide their op-ed writing and that have subsequently been published. Canada's toxic chemicals plan is failing us. Temporary foreign workers are a temporary fix. Patients can help stop looming antibiotic crisis. And prisons aren't equipped to handle the mentally ill. You can see how short and focused and clearly worded these thesis statements are. That's what you're aiming for. If you make your thesis statement too long and complex, if there are multi-clauses, you'll find it very difficult once you get started writing to be able to effectively support the claim that you're making in the thesis statement. So simple is always better. Also, let me be clear. The thesis statement that you write at this point in the process won't necessarily appear in the op-ed. It might, but it's really there as a guideline for you to help you decide what information and evidence and support to keep in and what to leave out. Your goal is that every sentence in your commentary leads people to conclude after they've read what you've written that yes, X, your thesis, is in fact true. Step number 2 is marshalling evidence in support of the thesis statement that you've made. Sometimes people come up with a thesis and then when they get to the evidence part of the exercise, they realize, oh, well, I really believe my thesis to be true, but I actually can't find any concrete convincing evidence that will help me persuade other people that it is true. That's the point at which you have to come up with a different thesis. But let's say your thesis is solid, and now what you're looking for are ideally at least 3 different kinds of evidence that support and back up the claim that your thesis makes. You can draw on everything from research, historical precedents, international precedents, case studies, expert findings, polling data, an authoritative text or respected authority, your personal experience, testimonials from others, and logic. Once you've marshaled evidence in support of your thesis and you think it's pretty solid, then what you want to do is step number 3, the counter statement. In this phase, you want to anticipate what your likely critics are inclined to say to push back and discount the claim that you're making. In anticipating and then refuting their arguments, you make your commentary stronger. So you might start with a sentence like, to be sure, many people argue that X. However, Y is in fact true, and let me show you how I know this. Here's a concrete example. A few years ago, the federal government decided briefly that they were going to change the lyrics to O Canada to include women. But there was a big response from many of the people in their constituency who disagreed with the proposal, and so they backtracked. In the 24-hour window between the announcement and the backtrack, I wrote a commentary supporting the government's initiative and arguing that yes, the lyrics to O Canada should be changed. I happened to be in my car listening to CBC radio, and I heard many of the callers into CBC who objected to the plan. And so I knew what people who disagreed with me would say, and I incorporated their arguments into my op-ed as the counterstatement. I said, to be sure, some critics will say you can't change the lyrics to O Canada because that's messing with Canadian heritage and tradition. However, the lyrics to O Canada have been changed twice already. Therefore, tradition or heritage has already been messed with, and we can do it again in pursuit of including women in Canada's national anthem. Stage 4 in the process is identifying a news hook. A news hook is essentially the justification that you present to the editor to convince them to run your piece now as opposed to next month or never, because really, that's what next month means. In the case of my O Canada op-ed, it was timely because the government had just made an announcement that I was responding to. I wrote my op-ed immediately after the government announcement, and it was placed in the newspaper the following day when people were still discussing the topic. If that's not the case, if you're writing about something that isn't in the news already, you need to work harder to find something to make it timely. Some strategies include citing new research that may not be as well known to others, or tying your issue to an event that's happening elsewhere or in the future. Sometimes people use as a news hook an imminent event or an anniversary that's coming up. I recall that during the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic, there were multiple news stories and commentaries that used that anniversary as their excuse for talking about something that was often only tangentially related. Google alerts are also a useful strategy for those who are writing regularly about the same issue. So you go to Google and you set up an alert on a particular issue or phrase, words, a topic, so that every time that topic or that set of words appears anew on a website, you get an email letting you know that there's some new development somewhere in the world. Often the Google alerts won't be useful for you, but every now and again you'll hit gold and you'll learn about something that allows you to bridge or hook your story to a development that you otherwise wouldn't have learned about. You can sometimes also get away with hooking your issue to a pop culture phenomenon. A few years ago, I was writing about the dangers of breast implants, and Cameron Diaz happened to be starring in a movie called Bad Teacher. It was a bad movie, but it featured breast implants. And so I used Cameron Diaz and the popular movie as a way into the op-ed pages talking about the dangers of breast implants. One of the things that might be useful for you is that knowing that news hooks are important to help you get into the paper or onto a website talking about an issue that you care about is when you're reading the news from now on, pay more attention to what it is that constitutes a saleable news hook. When you're reading other people's commentaries, notice what the reason for their commentary being in the paper on that day is. That might give you ideas for your own commentaries in the future. Finally, the lead. The lead is the opening sentence or paragraph, and it constitutes your opportunity to grab readers by the throat and make sure they keep reading. The reason we spell lead this way, it's not an error, It has to do with the fact that when newspapers were first developed and the letters that made up the press were made of lead, in order to distinguish lead letters from the lead, the opening sentence or paragraph, lead was spelled this way. Now you know a little bit of newspaper arcana. There are a number of engagement strategies that are really useful. As I mentioned earlier, thinking about the human dimensions of a story and privileging those right at the start of your op-ed can be one of the ways to do that. Telling a story that's vivid and compelling and puts people right in the circumstance of the person whose story you're relating is also helpful. And sometimes using a dramatic or vivid analogy can help make something that's conceptual more easily relatable to a broader audience. I'm going to share with you some examples of leads that didn't quite hit the mark on their first go-round, and then show you what we came up with instead as a means of ensuring that readers were engaged off the top. Here's the first draft of a lead on an op-ed that was eventually published. Earlier this month, I had the opportunity to attend a session of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearing in La Ronge, Saskatchewan, as a participant in the Governor General's Canadian Leadership Conference. It's long. It's a long sentence. It's got lots of long words, and it doesn't really tell us anything compelling. Compare that one to this one. For one of the first times in my life, I felt ashamed of being Canadian. Would you keep reading? Does that engage you more than the first one? It certainly did me. And judging by the response that greeted Julie Cafley's op-ed when it was published in the Ottawa Citizen, I think that the opening line had a big impact on people's decision to keep reading. One of the ways sometimes to discover your best lead is to read through your draft after you've written it and find the most unequivocal and dramatic statement that you've made and see if there's a way to put that statement right at the top. In the case of this op-ed, that's in fact exactly what we did. Julie had written the sentence, she just buried it 3 or 4 paragraphs down, and we moved it up to the top of the op-ed because it was most compelling. Here's another example. We are all terribly exposed in Canada by the absence of a specific crime of invasion of privacy that might prevent naked photos being disseminated without our consent. So this one actually has naked photos in it. It's long, it has many subordinate clauses. In Canada, by the absence of a specific crime of invasion of privacy that might. It's very complicated, it's hard to follow, and so many people will stop reading even before they get to the reference to naked photos. Consider this rewrite. Have you ever permitted a lover to take nude photographs of you? Photos that you would really rather weren't made accessible to the entire world? Pretty much everybody can relate to that lead. Even if their answer is no, I would never do that, they are at least engaged by the question that asks them to reflect on their practice or behavior and think about the implications of having your lover take nude photographs of you and what would happen if they got shared. The op-ed itself remained the same, we just changed the lead, and it became, I think, much more engaging to a much broader audience. So the thing that you want to do most in the opening sentence or paragraph of your op-ed is to pique curiosity. You want to do that by asking a provocative question, using a compelling quote, relating a surprising fact or statistic, providing an interesting contradiction, challenging conventional wisdom, or, as I mentioned, referring to pop culture. One of the things about asking a question as your lead is that the question actually has to be one, the answer to which people care about. So if you ask a question like, should we have a new chemicals plan in Canada? If I don't know anything about chemicals or the fact that we even have a plan, let alone why it's not a good one, I'm less likely to keep reading than if you say something off the top that scares the bejesus out of me because of the chemicals plan that we have that is inadequate. So make sure you put the drama either into the question or into the lead in some other way. Okay, let's say you've finished the op-ed, you have a great thesis wonderful evidence, you've got a strong counter statement, you've got a good news hook and a really strong lead. Is your job finished? No. You need to edit and polish the piece so that when you send it in to the editor, she looks at it and says, this piece is ready to go. It requires no work on my part. You need to be your own editor. And here are some strategies for doing that. Ideally, you want a second reader. I've been writing professionally for 25 years, and I never, ever submit a commentary without having somebody else read it first, because they'll notice things that I took for granted. They'll call me out on language that I've used that I thought was accessible but might not be to others. They'll pick holes when I haven't effectively bolstered my case. Ideally, you want somebody who's not in your field to read the op-ed because they're more likely to notice language that's not accessible to other people. Secondly, you can put the draft aside for an hour at least, and 24 hours if you have the luxury, because you'll notice things later that you can't notice when you're immersed in the actual writing. I also find it easy if I print something off, I'll notice things on a printed page that I wouldn't have necessarily flagged when it's on my computer screen. I also will read my op-ed aloud to myself. That forces me to stumble over excessively long sentences or syntax that is awkward. It also helps me flag repeated references or words. If you use one word 10 or 20, or I read one the other day that used the word cancer 30 times, people's eyes glaze over with that amount of repetition. So you want to go back and look for ways to rephrase sentences to eliminate repetitious phrases or words. Editors are also really concerned that you keep to the specified word limit that they've identified. So the Ottawa Citizen, for example, will take op-eds of between 750 and up to 800 words sometimes, but the Globe and Mail requires 600 and no more. So you really don't want to send something that's too long for the vehicle that you're submitting to, because it will get tossed into the round file right away regardless of how great your arguments and evidence are. One other thing to look for in your piece is to make sure when you're reading the finished draft that you do in fact express a strong and clear opinion. It actually drives readers and editors nuts to read a piece where you're weighing both sides of an issue and it's not clear at the end of it what it is that you really think. If you have an informed opinion, we want to know what decision or conclusion you've come to. So make sure that your opinion for the opinion piece is actually present. You want not just the lead, but the entire op-ed to be as vivid and engaging as possible. You want to replace conceptual with concrete. You want to supplement general statements with specific ones. And you want to interrupt long sentences and paragraphs and even words with short ones. In fact, when you read the newspaper, you'll notice that newspaper style is for very short paragraphs. If you're used to writing academically, you'll often have very long paragraphs, but that's a deterrent to readers, especially when they're reading online or in a newspaper. They're busy, and shorter paragraphs keeps them reading. Let me give you just one example of a sentence that is long and abstract and conceptual where it doesn't need to be. We are pursuing mechanisms to enhance equity within the pedagogical environment to reduce attrition rates. You might have understood that, but lots of people won't, or they'll simply stop reading. And there's a much more dynamic and concrete way to say the same thing. The project aims to make classrooms fairer so more kids stay in school. Right away, a reader can imagine classrooms, can imagine kids, can imagine school in a way that she couldn't imagine attrition rates or pedagogical environment. So look for ways to make sure that you're speaking or writing as concretely as possible. As a backup, you can always run your completed text through the Gunning Fog Index. You can cut and paste your text into a box on the Gunning Fog website, and it will calculate the length of sentences and the words that you've used and spit out a number that reflects the number of years of education a reader will be required to have in order to easily make sense of what you've written. You might be surprised. The Gunning Fog Index is a really useful tool. It doesn't tell you which words or sentences to cut or eliminate or edit, but it will give you some feedback about how impenetrable your prose actually is. Okay, your op-ed is finished, it's polished, it's accessible, it's lively, it's engaging, and now comes the time to submit it to the editor with a compelling pitch that convinces the editor why she should read it and publish it now. So in one paragraph, you want to convince the editor that the thesis, the topic that you're writing about, is timely and interesting. You want to demonstrate why you're the best person to talk about it and to weigh in, and you want to convince her to run it now, not never. Once you've crafted your 1 or 2 sentence pitch to the editor, you're going to copy and paste your actual op-ed into the message box of your email. You're not going to send it as an attachment because that's one extra step for the editor, and it may in fact be a deterrent to her even opening your email. If she doesn't know you and there's an attachment, sometimes they don't bother. So you want your op-ed in the message box immediately beneath your pitch, and your pitch is immediately followed by your name, obviously, and your phone number, which allows her to contact you if she's interested by phone. And at the very bottom of your commentary, you want to insert one line that makes clear your credential relevant to the topic that you've chosen. So you might say, Jane Doe is researching copyright in Canada, or is an associate professor at the University of British Columbia, or is the author of a book on the topic, or has served on a panel or committee related to the issue, or is a recognized expert in this area. So something like that, just one line that sums up what your experience is. As for how you reach the editor, on the Informed Opinions website in our resources section, we have an entire page that lists the names and email addresses of most of the op-ed page editors at major dailies and prominent news websites in Canada. If our resources section doesn't in fact identify the editor of the vehicle that you're interested in submitting to, usually you can find that by going to their website, by looking at their contact page, and if they don't specify exactly who to send something to, just give them a call and say, I'd like to submit a commentary, to whose attention should I send it? After I've emailed my commentary to an op-ed page editor, I'll often follow up with a voicemail message reminder just to say, I've sent you this commentary, please let me know if you haven't received it. It's just a second hit at the editor letting them know that it's there, it's timely, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. If the editor has decided he or she wants to publish your op-ed, you'll usually hear from them in a day or two after submitting it. If you don't hear back from them, don't take it personally. They often receive 10, 20, sometimes 30 op-eds in a day. They have to wade through all of those and pick the ones that are not only polished, but also fit into whatever is current and urgent in the news at the time. And they're also dealing with limited space. So if your op-ed doesn't make the cut, it may have nothing to do with the quality of your argument and your writing. It may simply be a matter of other news taking priority at that time. What you might do then is rework the op-ed, submit it elsewhere, or change the lead and the news hook a month or two down the road and send it in again when circumstances might give it a better chance of being accepted and published.